On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Nadav Eiron. He is the SVP of Cloud Engineering at Crusoe. We're going to be talking about leading organizations. And what do I mean by that? Well, obviously a team and a group of individuals are two different things. We're going to be talking about what it takes to get everyone to push in the right direction, talk about translating some of those engineering skills that scale. And obviously if small companies want to be big companies, they need to do some things right to get there. And we're going to try to touch on something that Nadav mentioned about big companies moving slow stigma. I think that's actually a really interesting one. Hopefully we have enough time to cover all this. Nadav, thanks for taking the time to join the show.
Thank you, Amir. Pleasure to be here.
All right, absolutely. Thank you. Tell us what the company does, just high level, so people know the context before we dive in.
Of course. So Crusoe is a very interesting company. The company's mission is align the future of computing with the future of the climate. So what we do is we kind of like do a vertically integrated AI-first approach to computing, where we start with the energy sources, the actual physical infrastructure for ML compute, and go all the way up the stack to providing ML services with an eye towards how that affects the climate and making sure that we do that in a responsible way.
Awesome. I mean, we could probably do a whole show just on the cool things you're doing from a company perspective, but in this case, maybe we'll have you back on. But this episode, we're touching on obviously leading a company, leading an organization. I jotted down something interesting that I think maybe we'll start with, is that you said obviously a team is very different than just a group of individuals, a group of people. Talk to us about your view of what that means, and we'll dive in from there.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of literature on the subject and a lot of prior art of the role of leadership and kind of like making people work on something that's bigger than themselves, right? Like the default for people is to think of their own personal interests. And when you bring people together into a team, you know, I just mentioned Crusoe's company mission. You really want them to put that mission statement to some extent, in some contexts, some of the time, ahead of their own personal interests. And like I said, there's a lot of art in that. There's a lot of art is probably the right word to talk about it. There's science, but there's a lot of craft and art in how you get people motivated to actually align to this bigger goal. One of the things that works in our advantage is that people are social animals. They actually want to work on something that's bigger than themselves. They don't always want to admit that. They sometimes are not explicit about that prioritization. But people are actually pretty altruistic if you give them that environment and you give them something that's bigger than themselves. And I see that as one of the biggest roles of leadership, is to make people be part of a team and put that team ahead of themselves.
I like that. I like the way you put that. I guess when you're looking at people and you're trying to, obviously they believe in something bigger, believe in something that will help unify them. When you're thinking about engineering teams, and obviously within engineering, there are different teams that have different makeup, but different types of skill sets, different personalities. It's a very complex ecosystem once you start looking past, just the technical side. When you're looking at that and you're looking at, hey, how do I help make sure that the team in general is moving the right direction by making sure that each individual smaller team, each individual person understands what that direction is? Does the communication of that quote unquote direction change per team? Is it a unified message? How do you approach that?
It's always a challenge. If you think about it, people hold multiple identities. There are multiple team identities, especially as an organization grows. Earlier in my career, I was at Google, and relatively early in my career there, I got my first remote team, or maybe it was my second remote team, I don't remember. And you deal with like this question. So, I have a team in California and I have a smaller team in Zurich. How does the team in Zurich define themselves? Are they people in Zurich working on my bigger team, or are they the part of my team that happens to be in Zurich? Because they do hold these two identities. They're both they're both distinct from the rest of my employees in the sense that they live in a different country and they work in a different time zone, but they're also part of that team. And so there is, like I said, it's not a science, it's an art. You need to balance these things. You need to understand how much you want the local versus the global. And the same is true when it's not geography that separates, but function or area of work or skill set. Another classic example is SREs versus the development team. They're both working together on one mission, which is, to build the product to put in the hands of customers, but they have a slightly different way of looking at it. SREs kind of like tend to be more conservative and optimize for what works, versus developers want to move fast and break things. And so you want to have these two forces pulling against each other so you find a good middle ground. At the same time, you also want them to feel like they're both working towards building the best product possible. So again, that's the work of leadership, finding those balances and fine-tuning them for the situation, the organization, your technology, your business is in right now. It changes.
Interesting. Yeah, I love how you mentioned the team holds different identities, and obviously your example with the team in Zurich was very interesting. And I guess as you're kind of looking at, I'm going to take a step back to dealing with remote, because I'm kind of curious, because as I'm thinking about this dynamic, you mentioned managing your first remote team, this idea of rowing in the same direction, being able to understand these identities. I also think we spent decades upon decades building structures that let us be comfortable with understanding those identities when they're in front of us. I think the pandemic caused some of that to go away, and now there's a bit of a confusion as to, I can do the work remote, but as a leader, you're trying to understand these individual identities, the team identities. Maybe talk to us a little bit, because I know you have experience, also dealing with remote. Maybe talk to us a little bit about the challenges and how they're being solved, because obviously people like remote. Doesn't mean that the company does, but from a leadership perspective, how are those challenges being dealt with?
It's an interesting thing, and maybe this will also be a good segue of all things, our conversations of big companies versus small companies. I think, remote is one manifestation of Conway's law, which is the output that you get is a reflection of the communication channels you have within your organization. As people are in different places, as the communication channels become more or less formal, depending on what technology you have to use, et cetera, that will impact everything. It will impact the output, it will impact the dynamics. But the remoteness by itself is just one way in which communication channels get longer. And, when COVID hit and remote work started, the first thing that bothered me as a leader, people sometimes ask me, like, what I do is I talk to people all day long. And the hardest thing was like sitting in a group meeting, in a staff meeting, whatever, and looking at someone and they're like maybe not paying attention, or kind of like cringing when someone else talks, or, something is left unsaid in the room. And I cannot walk to them at the end of the meeting and take them aside and see what's happening. That's the thing that I miss with remote work. At the same time, I mentioned the issue of scale, and we started talking about a remote team. Like, people can be in the office and your communication with them still has to be this structured, and you're not actually meeting them in the hallway, because there's too many hallways, right? Like, at the point when a company has, 1,000 people on a site, they'll be in different floors, maybe they're in different buildings. People are too lazy to get up from their desk anyway, and you'll see them in the staff meeting dialing in, even though physically they're in the office and they're actually maybe in the same building with you or across the street. So this is what I'm saying. It's not to me a qualitative difference, remote versus in person. It's more of a quantitative difference. Like, how much do you have this problem of people being lazy and not getting up from their seat to talk to someone in person? Maybe remote is kind of like the extreme of that. It happens in the office too.
That's actually a really good point. And I think, yeah, thinking back, I'm like, you're right. That actually happened even before the notion of remote existed. Let's say 20 years ago, there were people dialing in, just would not walk down the hallway. They just wanted to sit for whatever reason, multitask. They had their own, way of getting into that meeting, and no one really actually raised a concern. Interesting. That's a great observation. And I wanted to highlight your background. You worked at Google, you're at Crusoe now, you've worked remote. When you think about the speed at which you have to handle and manage at Crusoe versus, let's say, at Google, you're still looking at team identities. You're trying to find the right way to communicate, because obviously you're looking for a certain cadence, a certain velocity, a certain quality balance, all these different things. Is there a stigma that exists from people working at big or small companies in terms of the pace they can move at?
For sure, there is, and I've seen it on both sides, right? Like when you work at a small company, there's like, oh, let's not become a big company. Let's not lose our ability to move fast. When you work at a big company, you sometimes hear like, let's think like a small company, and it's a little bit like what I mentioned on the remote work and whether you see people in person or not. There's just laws of nature of scaling that make things different, and I think both sides don't appreciate some of those constraints maybe to their fullest extent. So, when you look at the life of, let's say, an individual engineer at a large tech company versus a small company, their life actually allows them to move faster at a large company because their infrastructure is better. Like, they'll have a better workstation. They'll have better tools on that workstation. A lot of the infrastructure will be done for them. They will not have to worry about logging or testing infrastructure or the build system or like a whole bunch of stuff that you need to worry about as a smaller company because nobody else will do that for you. So in terms of like what percentage of time they actually have to like sit down and write the code for the component they're working on, a large company, they should be more productive. And part of the issue is larger companies actually solve larger problems. And very early in my career, and I kill myself for not remembering who told me that, but someone told me that all problems are really hard if you scale them up enough. And I came to appreciate that with, generative AI, because generative AI is just adding and multiplying numbers, and they're actually small numbers. They're like, 8-bit numbers at best. And if you get the answer a little wrong, that's okay too. Like it's the easiest problem in the world. So what's the big deal about generative AI? You do a quadrillion of those a second for months. That's where it gets difficult. And big companies are a little bit in that place. Like, how hard can it be to do something, to build this software component? At a big company, it actually does a lot more other things. It has a lot more constraints. You'll have higher quality bars. You'll need to interface with more things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you actually do more. It's not that you, as an engineer, don't move fast. You move faster, but you're actually solving a bigger problem. Small companies allow themselves to ignore some of those constraints and limit the problem. Again, as a leader and as someone who gives engineers problems to solve, this is something you can adjust. You can make problems smaller for people. That's really useful. There's a lot of, I would say, lore or, legacy of like engineers want to solve things perfectly. They want their solution to address all possible scenarios. So as a leader, you can make the problem smaller. That will make things move faster. There's also this issue that we touched upon of Conway's Law and communication and whatnot. As a leader, simplifying communication channels is something that I think is super valuable. And the way it comes into existence is actually sometimes counterintuitive, because a lot of companies, especially here in Silicon Valley, they hold collaboration and like everybody does, everybody gets to be part of the party as a value. But actually people move faster if they have autonomy. And so figuring out how to break a problem into autonomous components that have low bandwidth, well-defined interfaces between them is really useful to get a high-performing team. Luckily for me, since I have, a computer science education, that's also good software engineering. So I always tell people, like, building good organizations is the same as building good software. You just need to define the APIs and minimize interactions across them.
I like that. And I think as you were speaking, I was thinking about something you said about people, moving in the right direction together. The notion of big company, small company, the size and scope of the problem. Can you define something more clearly to give somebody who's working on a very defined problem to solve? It seems like sometimes when we talk about this big company, small company, this lens, maybe especially from the leadership perspective, is sometimes not as easy to refocus because you do sometimes see, I don't want to hire a leader from a big company. Okay, well, Crusoe did with you, and obviously, they saw value. I don't want to hire somebody from a small company to go to a big company. This lens adjustment, is it as difficult from a leader to adjust this lens of being able to define that problem and help the team execute? Is it a real problem, or is it a perceived problem of potentially having people self-select into, a group easier when they're trying to find people to hire?
So I'll tell you one thing in general about, how I see, work and hiring. I love diversity of thought. And so I would welcome someone from a small company and a large company, and I would welcome someone from a large company and a small company just because they have a different perspective. It doesn't, the perspective doesn't have to be better or worse. It's different. That's already value. And I'm happy to be here, and I see how my perspective is different from the perspective of people who grew up at Crusoe. And I was happy to hire people from startups into Google and see how their perspective is different. As long as everybody agrees, these perspectives need to come together towards what we talked about before. Everybody has to agree on what we're here to achieve, and that we bring our skills to the table to achieve that goal. Fortunately for me, Crusoe is trying to achieve scale and grow quickly, and having that perspective of what's the difference between a smaller company and a bigger company obviously is helpful when you make that journey from a smaller company to a bigger company. So I feel lucky to be here. I hope the people that hired me feel the same. But I just like diversity of thought, and that's just one dimension of diversity.
Absolutely. You mentioned small companies wanting to grow and become bigger companies. A lot of times we see within small companies, people are very focused on the right person at the right phase of that company's growth, because that leader or that IC is good at executing within those parameters, those constructs. I guess when somebody hires somebody, as Crusoe did with you, they bring in somebody with a big background from Google. They'd like to be big. I'm assuming, as every for-profit company is looking to be big. You bring some value in terms of some of those things that you've seen that potentially you can tap into your toolbox, but also you might have to taper what tools you reach for, because obviously you're at a different stage. Talk a little bit about this notion of hiring someone, especially on the leadership side, that has the right skill set for the right phase. Is that, and a lot of companies do it, some companies don't, but a lot of times we do see it.
I can take this a few different ways. First, in hiring, again, in general, I like to hire ahead. I don't like to hire for the problem I have today. I'd rather hire for the problem I have in a year or two, because people take time to ramp up, and you don't want to throw a person out the window in a year. That's not a good way to build your talent pool. It's also not a good way to build your company, because when you have, you create this vacuum of someone who wants to be bigger, who wants to do these things, that will be a force that moves your company in that direction. So I think there's a little bit, given the opportunity to hire people who are overqualified, air quotes, in this dimension of the size, the phase, whatever, I think that's a positive. That would be a force that pulls you forward. Versus if you hire someone for today and then you grow quickly, they're going to hold you back. So that's one dimension that I would react to it. Obviously, you mentioned using the right tool for the job. We all fall into the trap of seeing nails when all we have is a hammer. And again, that's where having a diverse team comes into play, right? Like you want people with a hammer, and you want people with screwdrivers, and you want people with a drill, all working together and understanding what they're building together. So again, I think that the trick is to bring in talent that has the scope or the capability to take you where you want to be, and then have people with all sorts of tools working effectively together.
I think as I'm kind of listening, I keep thinking about. It sounds like if you are a leader, one of the objectives should be to be able to assimilate to that environment and leverage the toolbox tools. I think sometimes people get very comfortable with frameworks that they've operated in. And because somebody has operated within a framework, we're assuming they're going to carry success in with them, and they're just going to operate within that framework versus, who knows, maybe that environment was the right environment for them to succeed. But if you can interpret those tools and what they have in the toolbox better, you might have an employee, like you said, you don't have to replace sooner. They have a longer potential opportunity to be at a company. I guess, why is that the case that we sometimes, when it comes to evaluating people that come in with a particular framework and that we've seen work before, we gravitate towards it? Well, I mean, I think I know why, but it's because as humans, we do look for easy signals for success. That's an easier signal for success than to go, oh, I'm going to map Nadav's leadership from Google to Crusoe. And that's a harder thing to see through. Is it a case of we need to, and you keep talking about diversity, is it a case that we just need to look at the other person's perspective and their career trajectory and their actual work done and evaluate that differently than we might be doing?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you're 100% right. I think again, going back to my academic education in computational learning theory, what do people learn in their career? What are actually the skills that they bring? It is a fine question. How do you define what you've learned? You could look, let's say, at my career of 18 years at Google and say, well, Nadav learned how to build, I don't know, data processing systems that are planet scale. But if you ask me, that's not what I learned at Google. What I learned at Google is how to build effective organizations at different scales, how to evolve an organization with the technology, with the business together. It took me a while to actually articulate that this is what I've learned. But I do think we look at skills and at careers at too shallow of a level in terms of what people actually learn. A lot of those skills are transferable. And I think, to be successful, you want to actually look at those skills that are transferable and be able to transfer them and be able to apply them to a new area. And it's actually, in my experience, easier than most people think it is.
I was going to say, I feel like if I don't wrap up the show, I could keep asking you questions for a very long time because A, you're easy to talk with, and B, I love your point of view. But I know you got to get back to the day job of actually leading your team. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing. I think you've had some fantastic insights that I hope the audience is going to appreciate. If someone's going to want to potentially ask you a question, I'm sure we didn't exhaust all the topics. What's a good way of connecting with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is pretty good. I'm very responsive online in general, so let's start there. And I want to thank you too. This was a lovely conversation. Like you say, I could easily have continued for much longer if I had the time.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you, and hopefully we'll bring you back. We'll do a part 2 down the road and kind of continue the conversation. Maybe you'll have a little bit more time, Crusoe. We'll dive in and get into some nitty gritty of execution while you're there as well. And I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you. Take care.
Absolutely. That's it for the episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. One, I really thought this was a great conversation around some of the things that I see in terms of hiring, especially when it comes to leadership. Nadav really talked about how to have people focus the energies in the same direction. We talked about small companies, big companies, some of those stigmas, some of the challenges in hiring for outside of what would be a framework that you think fits your company now. Please share this with somebody else. I thought it was a great conversation. Please do that. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.